Hello, my friends. So today I wanted to read to you a little article from the Dearborn Independent. This is the December 4th, 1920 edition of the Dearborn Independent. The title of the article is The Scope of Jewish Dictatorship in the United States. Money, men, materials, wages, and prices, all placed in the hands of Jews by president whom many believed played, quote, a lone hand. And the reason I'm reading this article today is because I came across this Twitter thread between Keith Woods and Nick Fuentes. Let me just move here so you could see. And here Keith Woods retweets a TikTok, silly little TikTok video where some Family Guy characters are talking about the Balfour Declaration and the role that Zionism and Jewish influence played in getting America to enter into World War I. Keith Woods says, America entered World War I 7 months before the Balfour Declaration. Fuentes responds, this is an oversimplification. It is well documented and undeniable that Zionist leaders negotiated with the British government to publicly support a Jewish homeland in exchange for American Jewish support for the war. This idea was conceived in 1915, 2 years before Balfour. Keith replies, that's true, but in the end, Zionists had little role in securing U.S. entry into the war. Probably the two most powerful Jews in the U.S. at the time, Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg, were opposed to Allied support. Warburg, as vice chair of the Federal Reserve, pushed for concessions to Germany. Schiff's Kuhn, Loeb & Co. was the only major Wall Street firm to refuse to lend to the Allies because of his hatred of Tsarist Russia. Zionists were a minority among Jews, but this was especially true among the elite Jews in the United States, who were motivated much more by opposition to Tsarist Russia. Although it was part of the British calculation to win support of American Jewry, their ultimate role in the U.S. decision to join the war was negligible, leaning the other way, if anything. And this is really kind of a surprising comment from Keith Woods, because it tells me, or at least it seems to me, that Keith Woods is reading at the most surface level of history possible, and he's taking sort of the word of these Jews at face value rather than digging a little deeper. Because if you do dig a little deeper, and I think I'm going to do a live stream on this, if you do dig a little deeper, these two Jewish men, Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg, who were allegedly opposed to Allied support, if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that it seems to me, and a lot of other people out there who have done research on this history, seems to me that they wanted to keep the United States out of the war until certain things were done within World War I. It was a calculated deferral of the United States' involvement in World War I. Number one, they wanted the war to drag on to cause the level of destruction that they wished to cause so that they could, profit from that destruction, weaken these countries that were involved, and then come in and dictate the terms of reconstruction, among many other things. And also with the whole Tsarist Russia thing, they didn't want to start lending to the Allies if money would go to the Tsarist regime, because they were planning the Bolshevik Revolution, and they didn't want to strengthen the regime that ultimately they wanted to topple and replace with a Bolshevik regime. So when it comes to Warburg and Schiff, like I said, I think I'm going to do a live stream on this and get into the details of these two fellas. Not only does it seem like they definitely weren't like patriotic Germans that were trying to support the German cause or opposed to war with Germany on principle or anything like that. No, it was a calculated deferment of the United States' entry into the war. And he gives these two names as sort of examples and sort of suggesting that these two powerful Jews were not Zionists, and that, there were very few actual elite Jewish Zionists at the time. But almost every Jew that I looked at, every powerful Jew that I've looked at during this period, even if they weren't outspoken political Zionists, behind the scenes they were supporting the Zionist cause by donating to charities, funding Jewish organizations. Many of them actually even attended these Zionist conferences, even if in public they said that they were not political Zionists. So it's a surprising comment from Keith. And the other thing is that he uses Schiff and Warburg and sort of props them up as probably the two most powerful Jews in the U.S. at the time. But one of the Jews that he missed was Bernard Baruch, who, as we'll see in this article from the Dearborn Independent, was, politically speaking and in relation to the war, was the most powerful Jew in the United States at the time. So I'm going to read this article, and then probably, tomorrow or the day after or sometime soon, I'll do a live stream and get really into the weeds of this moment in history, because it's a very interesting time, and there's a lot of rabbit holes that we can go down, and we'll definitely get into investigating Schiff and Warburg, the Warburg family, Baruch, various other powerful Jews at the time, and what they were doing behind the scenes, and how they were influential in getting the U.S. to start the war. And then we'll also talk about, the overall motivation of World War I, and why the United States' entry was deferred, and what sorts of things that they wanted done before the war was over that would cause this confusion where, it seems like, some Jews didn't want the U.S. to enter, and then, this is true also for Schiff and Warburg. They allegedly didn't want the U.S. to enter, but then as soon as the U.S. enters, they become like pivotal players in the war effort. So, we'll talk about that in detail in an upcoming live stream. But like I said, let's just get into the article. Fascinating little article from the Dearborn Independent. I recommend, going to the Dearborn Independent's archives and just searching the word Jew and checking out some of their articles, because this was a time when it's amazing to see like a mainstream newspaper was publishing so many valuable, insightful articles on the JQ. So let's get into it. The scope of Jewish dictatorship in the U.S., money, men, materials, wages, and prices, all placed in the hands of Jews by President whom many believed played a lone hand. Oops. I'm going to take my face off the screen. Okay. The common criticism made against President Wilson, that he, quote, played a lone hand and would not avail himself of advice, can be made only by those who are in ignorance of the Jewish government, which continually advised the president on all matters. While the president is supposed to have been extremely jealous of his authority, this view of him can be maintained only by remaining blind to the immense authority he conferred on the members of the Jewish war government. It is true he did not take Congress into his confidence. It is true that he made little of the members of his cabinet. It is also true that he ignored the constitutional place of the United States Senate in the advisory work of making treaties. But it is not true that he acted without advice. It is not true that he depended on his own mind in the conduct of the war and the negotiations at Versailles. Just when Bernard M. Baruch, the Jewish High Governor of the United States in war affairs, came to know Mr. Wilson is yet to be told. But just when he got into and out of the war are matters about which he himself has told us. He got into the war at Plattsburgh 2 years before there was a war, and he got out of the war when the business at Paris was ended. Quote, I came back on the George Washington, he testified, which means that he remained at Paris until the last detail was arranged. It is said that Mr. Baruch was normally a Republican until Woodrow Wilson began to loom up as a presidential possibility. The Jews made much of Woodrow Wilson, far too much for his own good. They formed a solid ring around him. There was a time when he communicated to the country through no one but a Jew. The best political writers in the country were sidetracked for 2 years because the president chose the Jewish journalist David Lawrence as his unofficial mouthpiece. Lawrence had the run of the White House offices, with frequent access to the president, and for a time he was the high cockalorum of the national newspaperdom. But neither that privilege nor the assiduous boosting of the Jewish ring availed to make him a favorite with the American public. Why the Jews changed party front? American Jewry was democratic until it had secured the last favor that Woodrow Wilson could give, and then it left the Democratic Party, as with the indecent haste of rats leaving a sinking ship. Baruch stayed rather ostentatiously, spending his money for motion picture appeals in favor of the League of Nations, but it is entirely probable that he has a genuine interest in the new administration. For one thing, there may be investigations. It remains to be seen whether the investigations which the Republican majority in the White House, or the Republican majority in the House, began to make with regard to war expenditures will be continued. There are those who profess to believe that they will not be continued, the explanation being that such investigation as was made before the election was solely for the purpose of securing campaign data or creating a political atmosphere unfavorable to the Democrats. It is sincerely to be hoped that the Republicans will not rest under that imputation, but that they will rigorously pursue the investigations that have begun. There are 2 reasons why this should be done. First, that the country may know, with a view to future contingencies, what was put over on the government during the war. Second, that the full sweep of Jewish influence in this country may be exposed. The second reason is not expected to appear very weighty to practical politicians, and that is no matter, for if the first reason is deemed sufficient, and if the investigations are honestly made, then inevitably the Jewish power will be further exposed. It is linked up at every stage of the business. This may have had something to do with the sudden desertion of the Democratic Party by the Jews. They may have swung over in order to have something to say about the pursuit of further investigations. Already the council is being heard. Let bygones be bygones. The people are tired of investigations and don't want any more. Already, attempts are being made to introduce fresher issues to deflect the public mind from war affairs, and the attempts are doubtless Jewish in their origin. That portion of the public who are awake to the Jewish question will do well to observe with care the attitude of the new administration toward completing the investigations. The Jews did not flock to the Republicans for nothing. The country is entitled to know what was done with the fabulous amounts of money spent during the war. The people are entitled to know who were their masters and who were responsible for certain strange situations which were created. Members of the House, senators, and other officials should, at the very least, pay particular attention to the directions from which influences against further inquiry come. Now, as to Mr. Bernard M. Baruch, who, for some as yet undefined reason, was made head and front of the United States at war, we have his own word on several occasions that he was the most important man in the war. Quote, I probably had more power than perhaps any other man did in the war. Doubtless that is true, he told Representative Jeffries. And again, quote, we had the power of priority, which was the greatest power in the war. Exactly. There is no question about that. I assumed that responsibility, sir, and that the final determination rested within me. And when Representative Jeffries said, what? To that startling statement, Mr. Baruch repeated it. That final determination, as the president said, rested within me. Representative Graham said to him, in other words, I am right about this, Mr. Baruch, that yours was the guiding mind? And Mr. Baruch replied, that is partly correct. I think you are entirely correct. The scope of Baruch's war power. Now, in what did Baruch's power consist? Briefly, in the dictatorship of the United States. He once expressed the opinion that the United States could have been managed that way in time of peace, but he explained that it was easier in wartime, was made easy because of the patriotic mood of the people. It is not sufficient, however, to say that Mr. Baruch's rule constituted a dictatorship of the United States. It remains to be shown just how rigid and far-reaching that dictatorship was. The reader may recognize at what point the Jewish rule touched his affairs also. Mr. Baruch, who had the, quote, final determination of everything, says that his power extended to the needs of the Army and Navy, the Shipping Board, the Railroad Administration, touched also the Food and Fuel Administrations, and besides all that, had a vital control of the Allies' purchases, not only in the United States, but also in other countries with reference to certain materials. There were $30 billion spent by the United States government during the war, all of it raised by taxation and bonds. Of this sum, $10 billion was loaned to the Allies and spent here, all of the purchases being viséed under Mr. Baruch's authority. As told by himself, his power consisted in the following authorities. 1. Authority over the use of capital in the private business of Americans. This authority was nominally under the Capital Issues Committee, the controlling factor of which was another Jew, Eugene Meyer, Jr. Here is another inexplicable circumstance. Was he the only banker in the United States capable of exercising a dominant influence? Why did it happen that a Jew should be found in this important position too? Is it only accident? Was there no design involved? Well, it was necessary during the war for anyone wishing to use capital in business enterprise to lay all his cards on the table. He was required to reveal his plans, his ground for expecting success, in brief, tell the Jewish rulers and their Jewish representatives all that he would tell in confidence to his banker in negotiating a loan. The organization which a few Jews perfected was the most complete business inquisition ever set up in any country, and that the knowledge thus gained should always be sacredly guarded or always honestly used would be expecting too much of human nature. Having the say-so over Gentile business. Mr. Baruch gave some instances of this, though they were not the instances that are calculated to throw the most light on the inner workings of the organization. He said, quote, the Capital Issues Committee, where Mr. Meyer reigned, in the Treasury Department, had a man who sat with the War Industries Board, where Mr. Baruch reigned, and who always came to the War Industries Board to find out whether the individual or corporation who wanted this money was going to use it for the purpose to win the war. To cite a case that happened at Philadelphia, that city wanted to make extensive public improvements. New York wanted to spend $8 million for schools, which would take an enormous amount of steel, labor, materials, and transportation. We said, no, that won't help win the war. You can postpone that until later on. We cannot spare the steel on all these various things. Very well. Does Mr. Baruch know of an enormous theater which the Jewish theatrical owner was permitted to build in an eastern city during the war? Did he ever hear of non-Jews being refused permission to go ahead in a legitimate business which would have helped produce war materials, and that afterward, on almost identically the same plans and in the same locality, a Jewish concern was given permission to do that very thing? This was a terrible power, and far too great to be vested in one man. Certainly it was such a power as should never have been vested in a coterie of Jews. The puzzle of it becomes greater the deeper it is probed. How did it occur? How could it occur that always at the most critical and delicate points in these matters there sat a Jew enthroned with autocratic power? Well, could Mr. Baruch say, I had more power than any man in the war? He could even have said, we Jews had more power than you Americans did in the war, and it would have been true. 2. Authority over all materials. This, of course, included everything. Mr. Baruch was an expert in many of the lines of material involved, and had held interests in many of them. What the investigators endeavored to learn was in how many lines he was interested during the war. In the lines where Mr. Baruch was not expert, he, of course, had experts in charge. There was Mr. Julius Rosenwald, another Jew, who was in charge of supplies, including clothing, and who had a Mr. Eisenman to represent him. Mr. Eisenman was on the stand for a considerable period with regard to uniforms, the change made in their quality, the price paid to the manufacturers, mostly Jewish, and other interesting questions. The great Guggenheim copper interests, who sold most of the copper used during the war, was represented by a former employee, but undoubtedly Mr. Baruch himself, who was much interested in copper during his business career, was the principal expert in that line. Every line of industry in his hand. It is impossible to escape the names of Jews all down the line in these most important departments. But for the present, attention is called to the scope of Mr. Baruch's control in the country at large. It is best stated in his own words. No building, quote, no building costing more than $2,500 could be erected in the United States without the approval of the War Industries Board. Nobody could get a barrel of cement without its approval. You could not get a piece of zinc in your kitchen table without an approval of the War Industries Board. 3. Authority over industries. He determined where coal might be shipped, where steel might be sold, where industries might be operated, and where not. With the control over capital needed in business went also control of the materials needed in industry. This control over industry was exercised through the device called priorities, which Mr. Baruch rightly described as, quote, the greatest power in the war. He was the most powerful man in the war because he exercised this power. Mr. Baruch said that there were 351 or 357 lines of industry under his control in the United States, including, quote, practically every raw material in the world. End quote. I had the final authority, he said. Whether it was sugar or silk, coal or cannon, Mr. Baruch ruled its movements. Mr. Jeffress, quote, for instance, this priority that you had would decide whether civilians should have any commodities for building? Mr. Baruch, yes. If we had not had that priority committee, the civilians would have had nothing. Mr. Jeffress, did they get anything? Mr. Baruch, they got all there was. Mr. Jeffress, did you sit with these priority boards at any time or not? Mr. Baruch, sometimes. Not very frequently. I was made ex officio of every one of the committees, and made it my business to go around as far as I could and keep in touch with everything. Mr. Jeffress: And all these different lines really, ultimately, centered in you, so far as power was concerned? Mr. Baruch: Yes, sir, it did. I probably had more power than perhaps any other man did in the war. Doubtless, that is true. Let's go to the next page. That, however, was not the full extent of Mr. Baruch's control over industry. The heart of industry is power. Mr. Baruch controlled the power of the United States. The dream of the Power Trust, an evil dream for this country, was realized for the first time under the organization which this single individual formed. He says, quote, "Not only did we endeavor to control the raw materials, but as well the manufacturing facilities of the country. We established priority uses also for power." 4. Authority over the classes of men to be called for military service. Baruch pointed out to the Provost Marshal of the United States the classes of men to be taken into the army. Quote, We had to decide virtually the necessity of such things, he said. We decided that the less essential industries would have to be curbed, and it was from them that manpower would have to be taken for the army. In this way, he ruled chauffeurs, traveling salesmen, and similar classes into military service. It was, of course, necessary that some such ruling should be made, but why one man? Why always this one man? 5. Authority over the personnel of labor in this country. Quote, We decided upon a dilution of men with women labor, which was a thing that had always been fought by the labor unions. Making costs eat up the income. 6. And now behold as complete an illustration of one part of the protocols as ever could be found in any Gentile government. Readers of previous articles will remember the passage, quote, We will force up wages, which, however, will be of no benefit to the workers, for we will at the same time cause a rise in the prices of necessities. End quote. Mr. Baruch at one time was inclined to sidestep the matter of fixing wages. He did not like the expression. But that the reader himself may decide, we quote the testimony in full. Mr. Jeffress: Did the War Industries Board fix the price of labor? Mr. Baruch: If you can call it that way, but I would not say so. No, sir. Mr. Jeffress: I am trying to get at what you did. Mr. Baruch: No, sir, we did not fix the price of wages. Mr. Jeffress: What did you do? Mr. Baruch: Just what I told you. Mr. Jeffress: Probably I am a little dense, but I did not catch it if you told me. Mr. Baruch: When the price-fixing committee fixed the price of steel, we will say, they say, this price is agreed upon, and you shall keep wages where they are. And those were the wages that were prevailing at the price we fixed. At the time prices were fixed, at first, they were very much higher than the prices that we fixed. Mr. Jeffress: When you got the price of any of these low materials, you would fix the price of labor that was to be employed in producing them? Mr. Baruch: To the extent that it should remain at the maximum of what it was when we fixed the price. Considering the weight of Mr. Baruch's authority and the stipulations he made, this was to all intents and purposes a fixing of the rate of wages. Jewish dictatorship in full flush. Now, as to the fixing of prices, Mr. Baruch is much more positive. In answer to a question by Mr. Garrett, Mr. Baruch said, quote, We fixed the prices in cooperation with the industries, But when we fixed a price, we fixed it for the total production, not alone for the Army and the Navy, but for the Allies and the civilian population. The minutes of one of the meetings of Mr. Baruch's board shows this. Quote, Commissioner Baruch directed that the minutes show that the commission had consumed the entire afternoon in a discussion of price fixing, particularly with reference to the control of the food supply, grain, cotton, wool, and raw materials generally. Mr. Graham, tell me something else. How much personal attention did you give to the matter of price fixing? Mr. Baruch, in the beginning, considerable. At another time, Mr. Baruch said, there was no law at all in the land to fix prices. Mr. Jeffress, we grant that, but you did it. Mr. Baruch, yes, we did it, and we did a great many things in the stress of the times. Here was one man having supreme dictatorial power at both ends of the common people's affairs. He admits that of the 351 or 357 lines of essential industry which he controlled, he fixed the prices at which the commodities should be sold to the government and to the civilians. In fixing the prices, however, he made wage stipulations. The matter of wages came first. It entered into Baruch's computation of the cost on which, to a certain extent, he based the price. Then, having decided what the producer was to receive in wages, he decided next what the producer should pay for a living. The producer himself may answer the question as to how it all turned out. Wages were high, but not quite so high as living. And the answer to both is the testimony of Barney Baruch. That is not the whole story by any means. It is inserted here to find its place in the list of authorities conferred to Mr. Baruch. How completely Baruch felt himself to be the power is shown by a passage which occurred when he was trying to explain the very large profits made by some concerns with which he did business. Mr. Jeffress, then the system which you did adopt did not give the Lukens Steel and Iron Company the amount of profits that the low-producing companies had? Mr. Baruch, no, but we took 80% anyway from the others. Mr. Jeffress, the law did that, didn't it? Mr. Baruch, yes, the law did that. Mr. Graham, what did you mean by the use of the word we? Mr. Baruch, the government did that. Excuse me, but I meant we, the Congress. Mr. Graham, you meant that the Congress passed a law covering that? Mr. Baruch, yes. A merited rebuke. Mr. Graham says, did you have anything to do with that? Mr. Baruch, not a thing. Mr. Graham, then I would not use the word we if I were you. Whether Mr. Baruch slipped up there, he best knows, just as he had power to give the workers wages and take it away again by price fixing, so he had power to allow the raw material corporations to make fabulous profits, and it would not be at all unthinkable that he also had something to do with taking part of it away again. He said once, quote, we took away 80%, end quote. Then he confessed it was a slip of the tongue or of his prudence. Certainly, the profits he allowed were so large, even where the 80% was paid back, where it was paid back, there were all kinds of evasions and frauds. The profits were still enormous. And 73% of the war millionaires of New York, in spite of the 80%, are Jews. So, that is the end of that article. Hope you enjoyed, and you can look forward to a live stream where we'll get into a lot more than just Bernard Baruch, although he was a major figure. And by the way, he was also a sort of a crypto-Zionist. In public, he wasn't a quote-unquote political Zionist, but behind the scenes he was donating and associated with various Zionists. So that's Bernard Baruch for you. Arguably the most powerful Jew in America at the time. And by the way, he didn't just get involved with Wilson at the start of the war. He got involved with Wilson a full year before the war began. So arguably he pushed for the war. So anyway, thank you all for watching. See you guys at the live stream. Take care.